Today, in Yahushua chapter 11, the focus shifts from the conquest of the kings in the southern region of the land of Canaan and focuses on the northern region. In verses 1 to 5, the northern confederates of upwards of 8 kings joined forces and marched against Israel. Only this time they were equipped with both horses and chariots. A formidable army came against the small force of Israel, who neither had horses nor chariots. In verse 5, all the kings met together and then came and pitched their camp at Merom Spring to fight Israel. Now the Merom Spring is located approximately 10 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. The Merom Spring is approximately 70 miles from Gilgal, which was where Israel's base camp was situated. But the narrative does not say how Yahushua got his fighting men to be at the Merom Springs. Yahushua knew that he had to battle those northern kings at some stage, even though he was based far away at Gilgal. Was he being drawn out to fight far from a base territory he had never seen because he'd never been in the land until that time? Was this another ploy of the adversary, the arch enemy of Yahweh, who was trying desperately to lure Yahushua into a battle that he was convinced Yahushua would never win? By contrast, in verses 6 and 7, Yahweh tells the battle-weary war Yahushua, don't be afraid, because once again Yahweh will hand over the enemy to you. The message concludes with the words, all the enemy of Israel will be dead. Now upon hearing these words, Yahushua was reassured that he may have well been reflecting back on what Moshe had said to him, back on the plains of Moab, regarding the battles that he would face. In Devarim chapter 7, verse 7, Moshe said, Yahweh didn't set his heart against you, or choose you, Israel, because you numbered more than other people. On the contrary, you are the fewest of all people. Now again, Yahushua was having to trust Yahweh would do what he had done in the past. He knew that he was expected to go forth and confront this mighty northern confederate of kings on their own turf. This was rather than the usual forces of the universe, however, Yahweh plans to make Yahushua and his men take action this time by hamstringing the horses and burning the chariots. So how is he going to do this? This is a formidable force that he's facing. If we go to verse 7, it jumps forward to the place of battle, saying, so Yahushua came against them suddenly with all the fighting men, and they fell on them at Merom Spring. Yahushua did what Yahweh ordered and hamstrung the horses and burned the chariots. That command appears to be at first to be a rather gross and wasteful way to treat horses. The horse that has been hamstrung must be put down, because once the tendon in the leg is cut, it can never recover. However, Yahweh had handed over the confederacy of northern kings to Yahushua, and Yahushua chased them westward, northward to the greater Zion, and eastward towards the Mizpeh Valley. It appears likely that verse 9 should be read ahead of verse 8, because the men of Israel on foot could not have kept pace with the retreating kings on horses and chariots. Therefore, it seems likely that Yahweh had thrown these kings and their men into complete confusion just after Yehoshua had surprised them with his arrival. In that, amidst that confusion, that he would have had the opportunity to hamstring the horses and burn the chariots. Just as what had happened previously to the 5 kings in the southern area in chapter 10, verse 10, during the Battle of Givon, where Yahweh also threw the kings into confusion. Now we see the northern kings running for their lives in 3 different directions and being pursued by the small army of Israel. Now Yahweh had a twofold reason for demanding that the horses be hamstrung and that the chariots be burned. If Yehoshua had not crippled those horses and burned the chariots, the men of Israel would doubtless have taken possession of them and chased those kings. In that situation, Israel themselves would have claimed the victory at their own hands, and once again they would have failed to give the glory to Yahweh. Previously, Yahweh had made it very clear in a statement to Moshe in Devarim chapter 17 verse 16 regarding kings and horses. He, the king of Israel, is not to acquire many horses for himself or have people return to Egypt to obtain more horses, insomuch as Yahweh told you never to go back that way again. So Israel had been told to cripple the horses and burn the chariots. They were once again being forced to rely entirely upon the might of Yahweh. Yahweh also expressed his disdain for Israel's reliance on horses. In Isaiah chapter 31 verse 1, "Woe to those who go down to Egypt expecting help, relying on horses, trusting in chariots, because they have many, but not looking to the Holy One of Israel, not consulting Yahweh." So having vanquished all the northern confederacy with the support of Yahweh, Yehoshua then turns and destroys Hatzor, which was at that time the unofficial capital of all the nations in the Northern Territory. It was somewhat like an ancient superpower. Everything living in that city was destroyed, and the city itself was burned to the ground. Yehoshua then moves on through all the other cities of the kings that had joined forces with the king of Hatzor, showing no mercy and instead putting to death all the inhabitants by the sword, just as Moshe had been told by Yahweh in Devarim chapter 7 verse 2 regarding those 7 nations. He said, when he does this, when Yahweh your God hands them over ahead of you, you will defeat them. You will destroy them completely. Do not make any covenant with any of them. Show no mercy. Moshe warned both Yehoshua and the people of Israel while they were still on the plains of Moab that they were not to intermarry with the people of those nations, because if they did, their children would be led away to worship false gods. Moshe also concludes his discourse with Yehoshua and the people of Israel, saying in verse 6 of chapter 7, For you are the people set apart as holy for Yahweh, your God. Yahweh, your God, has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. You are to be his unique treasure. In chapter 7, verse 15, Moshe gave orders to Yehoshua and to the rest of Israel, as Yahweh had given orders to Moshe himself, as his servant and Yehoshua acting accordingly. Yehoshua did everything that Yahweh had ordered through Moshe. He remembered also what Yahweh had said in Devarim chapter 6, verses 10 through 12. When Yahweh your God has brought you into the land that he swore to your ancestors Abraham, Yitzhak, and Jacob that he would give you, cities great and prosperous, which you did not build, houses full of all sorts of good things, which you did not fill, water cisterns dug out, which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees, which you did not plant. And when you have eaten your fill, then be careful not to forget Yahweh, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, where you lived as slaves. So in keeping with those words, Yehoshua spared the cities and the houses, along with the livestock, the food-bearing fruit plants, but he did take the spoil of a war and the booty for themselves. So returning back to the book of Yehoshua in chapter 11, verse 16 through 18, Yehoshua recounts how with the help and support of Yahweh, Israel had captured the land that had been promised to Abraham in the covenant about the land inheritance. Yahweh included everything from the Negev in the south all the way to the valley of Mount Hermon in the north, from the Yarden in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. It was foretold in verses 19 and 20, not one city made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivi living in Givon. For it was Yahweh who caused them to harden their hearts and come against Israel in battle, so that they would be utterly destroyed, so that they would not find favor, but be destroyed, in keeping with the orders Yahweh had given to Moshe. But what about the Anakim? All 7 nations that had been dwelling in the land since the time of the patriarchs were all vanquished, including the Anakim, whom the adversary had planted in amongst those 7 nations. However, in verse 22 it says, no Anakim were left in the land of the people of Israel, only in Hazar, which is Gaza, Gat, and Ashdod, where some did remain. Now those cities, all of them, were strongholds of the Philistines, who remained constantly a threat to Israel. However, the Tanakh gives no explanation as to why Yahweh did not command Israel to destroy those people along with the other 7 nations. One possible explanation is that they were not descended from the Canaanite. Instead, history suggests that they originally came from the Aegean region, from Neolithic Greece. So whatever reason for their remaining, they always harbored amongst themselves some of the Anakim. As we see, of course, later on, in the time of Saul and King David, Goliath was the one who was part of the Anakim. He was a giant. So we see the Anakim was still there a long period after Yehoshua had conquered the rest. So chapter 11 concludes in verse 23 saying, then the land rested from war. So we move on to chapter 12. This chapter opens with a detailed recap of Israel's conquest east of the Yarden. As the second generation of Israel advanced towards the plains of Moab, at the end of their 38-year sojourn through the wilderness, they encountered 2 kings, Sihon and Og. As Israel advanced through their respective territories, they laid waste to all the people and the kings. Moshe said in Devarim chapter 2 verses 30 and 33, Sihon, king of Heshbon, would not let you pass through his territory, because Yahweh your God had hardened his spirit and made him stubborn, so that he could hand him over to you, as the case is today. And Yahweh our God handed him over to us, that we defeated him, his sons, and all his people. That was Sikon. Regarding Og, in Devarim chapter 3, verse 11, it says, he was a giant. Og, the king of Bashan, was the last survivor of the Rephaim. His bed was made of iron, and it was 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, using the normal cubit. In other words, 13 and a half feet by 6 feet. He was a giant. So the people of Israel, having earlier defeated both Sikon and Og, agreed that Moshe could give the territory of those 2 kings to the Reubeni and the Gadi and half the tribe of Manasseh as their possession. Now that territory east of the Jordan was never part of the covenantal promise to Abraham. But Moshe agreed that the 2.5 tribes, if they fought with their brothers under the leadership of Yehoshua, then Yahweh would allow them to remain and settle in that territory east of the river. The end of chapter 12 brings us to the end of all the battles and the displacement of the 7 nations that dwelt in the land. They'd been there since the time when Yahweh had cut the covenant for the promise of the land of Canaan with Abraham for all his descendants. The adversary had attempted to prevent possession of the land by Yahweh's people, but once again he'd failed completely, with most of the Anakim and the Rephaim also forcibly removed. The chapter concludes, as we read, recording the names of 31 kings that had been removed from the area. Israel was now ready to apportion the land among the 12 tribes, which we will consider in chapters 13 through 21. So what about Esau and Yaakov? Turning back to today's parashah, Toldot, we see it is also connected to some degree with the events that we are considering in the book of Yehoshua. While our involvement with Yehoshua today was with the northern territory, the presence of Esau in the southeastern corner of the land of Canaan were always a constant reminder to Israel that they were descended from the twin brother Esau. We read in today's parashah that there were problems between these twins even before they were born. The same animosity continued throughout their lives, right down through history, and between Edom and Israel. Even today, that animosity still exists. And as we see from our reading this morning in Romans chapter 9, God makes his own sovereign choices. Just because Esau was the firstborn did not automatically mean that Yahweh would make him his first choice. As we see through the words of the parashah, it was Yaakov through whom God's sovereign plan would continue and develop. In Bereshit, chapter 26, verse 34, when Esau was 40 years old, he took for himself 2 wives from among the daughters of the Hittite, both of whom caused great embitterment in spirit for Yitzhak and Rivkah. It must have been abundantly clear to Esau that his mother, where his mother's family origin lay. She was of the line of Abraham. Yet he, Esau, goes off and marries the local women. Also, Yitzhak himself must have made it known to Esau that Yitzhak's father, Abraham, had given strict instructions to his servant back in Bereshit chapter 24, where he said, I want you to swear by Yahweh, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that you will not choose a wife for my son among the women of the Canaanite, among whom I am living. but you are to go to my homeland, to my kinsmen, to choose a wife for Yitzhak. Esau had taken 2 wives well before Yitzhak gave the fatherly blessing to Yaakov. Esau, by marrying into the community Yahweh vowed would in the future be destroyed completely, rendered Esau totally incapable of carrying the responsibility of the firstborn in the development of God's sovereign plan. So he messed it up for himself by selling his birthright for a bowl of lentils and then going and marrying 2 of the local women who were destined to be destroyed. He destroyed his opportunity to be the firstborn. And much later, when Israel marched between Kadesh Barnea and Moab along the King's Highway, they should have passed through Edom, or Esau, Edom as it was known at that stage. But they refused to let Israel have right of passage through their territory. Yet again, the earlier familial hatred raised its ugly head. Again, at the time when Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem, Yahweh said that the actions of Edom were despicable. As he writes in Obadiah verse 10, "For the violence done to your kinsman Yaakov, shame cover you," that's speaking of Esau, "and you will forever be cut off." Now these are just a few of the reasons why Yahweh could say quite clearly in Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 through 5, "Esau was Yaakov's brother, yet I loved Yaakov, but I hated Esau. I made his mountains desolate and gave his territory to desert jackals." Edom says, "We were beaten down now, but we will be back and rebuild the ruins." But Yahweh Zebaoth answers, "They can build, but I will demolish. They will be called the land of the wicked, the people with whom Yahweh is permanently angry. You will see and say, Yahweh is great, even beyond the borders of Israel." So we see the animosity Yahweh has towards Esau is justified because of his own actions, and all the descendants of Esau taunted their brother Yaakov constantly and are still doing so even now in Israel. These are the very words that Shaul was quoting when he was lamenting over the condition of the greater majority of his brothers in Yehudah. During the 40 years between the death of Yeshua and the destruction of the Second Temple, he was pleading with them to recognize Yeshua as the Mashiach. Shaul was trying to convince his fellow Jews that they needed to repent, turn back, and accept Yeshua as the Mashiach. It was during that long discourse that we read in Romans chapter 9 that he quotes those words from Malachi about the future fate of Esau and all the descendants, that is, every generation of Esau. He was trying to show the men of Yehudah that if they continued on their current course, their actions towards Yeshua, they could well end up being hated by Yahweh just the same way as Esau had. So in conclusion, we have seen how Yahweh has always been ready and willing to make his own sovereign choices. Having made his covenant with Abraham, Yahweh also made an edict that when Israel returned to the land of Canaan, he would destroy all 7 nations, along with the Anakim, whom the adversary had planted amongst them. Because it was the land that Yahweh himself had chosen for himself and for his people. And the portion of the land amongst the whole of the territory of the earth, that was his. Therefore, it is fitting that Yahweh should have the last word on the whole matter of sovereign choice, as Shaul expressed it quite clearly in chapter 9. It is unjust for God to destroy. Is it unjust for God to destroy kings and people groups? Heaven forbid. For God can have mercy on whom he desires to have mercy, and he can have pity on those whom he desires to have pity. He alone is the sovereign of the universe, has the right to express righteous anger or mercy towards whomever he chooses. So let me conclude with the words of Shaul himself, where he quotes from Hosea about the future of those whom God chooses. Those who were not my people will be called my people. She who was not loved will be called loved. And in every place where they were told, in the very place where they were told, you are not my people, they will be called the sons of the living God. Shabbat Shalom.